Captain Sarah Mitchell had been flying A-10 Thunderbolts for 12 years, and she knew the sound of her own engine like a mother knows her child's heartbeat. On that cold morning in March, as she lifted off from Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada, everything felt right. The twin turbofan engines hummed with their familiar growl. The desert stretched below her like a wrinkled brown blanket. The sky was clear and impossibly blue. She was 41 years old, older than most active combat pilots, and she had heard the whispers. At the officers' club, in the hallways, even in the ready room. Too old. Past her prime. Should have taken a desk job years ago. The younger pilots, fresh from training with their cocky grins and perfect posture, looked at her like she was a relic from another era. Captain Jake Brennan was the worst of them, 28 years old with movie star looks and an ego the size of Texas. Just last week, he had cornered her after a briefing. "No offense, ma'am," he had said, his voice dripping with false respect. "But maybe it's time to let the younger generation take the stick. This isn't a job for someone thinking about retirement." Sarah had smiled tightly. "I'll retire when I can't do the job anymore, Captain. That day hasn't come." "If you say so." He had laughed, and the other young pilots had laughed with him. "Just don't want you putting the rest of us at risk when your reflexes slow down." She had walked away without another word. She had learned long ago that arguing with men like Brennan was pointless. You proved yourself in the air, not with words on the ground. Today's mission was supposed to be routine. A training exercise over the Nevada desert, practicing close air support maneuvers with ground units. 4 A-10s in formation, running mock attack patterns on dummy targets. Sarah was flight lead, which meant she was responsible for the entire group. It was a responsibility she took seriously. But the weather forecast had been wrong. An hour into the flight, clouds began rolling in from the west. Not the wispy, harmless clouds that dotted a summer sky, but thick, dark storm clouds that looked like bruises on the horizon. Sarah watched them approach with growing concern. "Viper 1 to Viper flight," she radioed to her 3 wingmen. "We've got weather moving in fast. Stay tight and be ready to break off if visibility drops." "Copy that, Viper 1," came the responses. The storm hit them like a freight train. One moment, Sarah was flying in clear air. The next, she was surrounded by a gray wall of clouds so thick she couldn't see her own wingtips. Rain hammered against her canopy. The plane bucked and shook as winds grabbed at it from every direction. "Viper flight, climb to Angels 20, she ordered, pushing her throttle forward. Angels 20 meant 20,000 feet well above the storm. "Stay on your instruments and maintain spacing." The radio crackled with responses, but the static was getting worse. Sarah focused on her instruments, trusting the gauges and displays even though every instinct screamed at her to look outside and see where she was going. But there was nothing to see out there except gray clouds and rain. Her altimeter climbed, 15,000 feet, 16,000. The turbulence was brutal, throwing the plane around like a toy. Warning lights flickered on her panel. Her right engine was running hot. "Viper 1, this is Viper 3, Jake Brennan's voice came through the static. "I've lost sight of you. What's your position?" "Climbing through 17,000, bearing 270, Sarah replied. "Follow your instruments and—" The explosion cut her off. It wasn't a missile or enemy fire. It was her right engine, torn apart by stress and bad luck and a maintenance issue that nobody had caught during the pre-flight inspection. The plane jerked violently to the right. Alarms screamed in her headset. Fire warnings lit up her cockpit like a Christmas tree. Sarah's training took over. She had practiced this 1,000 times in simulators. She pulled back the throttle on the damaged engine and activated the fire suppression system. Her hands moved across the controls with the precision of a surgeon, making adjustments, compensating for the loss of power, fighting to keep the plane level. "Viper 1 to base, I have an engine failure and fire," she said into her radio, keeping her voice calm and professional even though her heart was hammering in her chest. Attempting to maintain control. Static was the only response. She tried again. "Viper 1 to any station, do you copy?" More static. The storm had knocked out her long-range communications. She switched to the emergency frequency, then to the backup. Nothing worked. She was alone in a crippled plane, surrounded by clouds with no way to call for help. The fire suppression system finally kicked in and the flames died. But the right engine was completely dead, and the left engine was struggling to keep the heavy attack jet in the air. Sarah knew she had two choices: try to fly out of the storm on one engine or eject and hope the rescue teams could find her. She looked at her fuel gauge. She had maybe 30 minutes of flight time left, and that was if everything went perfectly. The storm stretched in every direction, and she had no idea where she was anymore. The GPS was glitching, probably damaged by the electrical surge from the engine explosion. But Sarah Mitchell had not survived 12 years of combat flying by giving up when things got hard. She had flown missions over Iraq and Afghanistan. She had brought damaged planes home before. She had faced down doubt and prejudice and every obstacle the Air Force could throw at her, and she was still here. She was going to make it home. Sarah gripped the stick and pushed forward, angling the nose down to pick up speed. If she could get below the storm, she could see the ground and navigate visually. The altimeter unwound as she descended. 18,000 feet, 15,000, 12,000. At 10,000 feet, she broke through the bottom of the clouds. But she wasn't over the Nevada desert anymore. Below her stretched an endless expanse of mountains and forests, all covered in snow. The storm had pushed her far off course, and she had been so focused on flying that she hadn't noticed how far she had drifted. She looked at her compass, trying to orient herself, and her stomach dropped. She was somewhere over the Sierra Nevada mountains, maybe even into California. Miles and miles from the nearest airbase, in some of the most rugged terrain in America. Her fuel gauge showed 20 minutes remaining. Sarah scanned the ground, looking for somewhere, anywhere she could set the plane down. But there was nothing except trees and rocks and steep mountain slopes. An A-10 wasn't designed for gentle landings in rough terrain. If she tried to land, she would probably crash. That left only one option. "I'm sorry, old girl," Sarah whispered, patting the control panel like she was saying goodbye to an old friend. "You got me this far." She reached down and pulled the ejection handle. The canopy blew off with a bang that left her ears ringing. A split second later, rocket motors under her seat fired, and Sarah was thrown up and out of the plane with enough force to knock the breath from her lungs. The wind hit her like a wall, spinning her around, and for a terrifying moment she couldn't tell which way was up. Then her parachute deployed with a crack, and suddenly everything was quiet. Sarah hung in her harness, swaying gently, and watched her plane disappear into the trees below. A moment later, she heard the distant crash and saw a plume of black smoke rise into the air. She looked around, trying to get her bearings. Mountains in every direction, trees as far as she could see, and the storm was still raging above her, dumping snow and rain on the wilderness below. Sarah pulled out her survival radio and tried to make a distress call. Static. She tried her GPS locator beacon. The light blinked once, then went dark. The electrical surge must have damaged it too. She was alone, miles from anywhere, with a storm closing in and night only a few hours away. But Sarah Mitchell had survived worse. She would survive this too. She pulled on the parachute risers, trying to steer toward a small clearing in the trees. If she could land there, she would have a better chance of staying mobile and finding shelter. The ground rushed up faster than she expected. Sarah bent her knees and prepared for impact, remembering her training. Feet together, knees bent, roll with the landing. She hit hard, the impact jarring every bone in her body, and rolled across frozen ground. Her parachute dragged her for a few feet before she managed to hit the quick release. She lay there for a moment, taking inventory. Nothing broken. A few bruises. She had been lucky. Sarah stood up and gathered her parachute, stuffing it into her survival pack. The wind was picking up and the temperature was dropping fast. She could see her breath in the air. She needed to find shelter and fast. She looked at the sky, trying to judge how much daylight was left. Maybe 3 hours if she was lucky. 3 hours to find shelter, build a fire, and prepare to survive the night in these mountains. Behind her, smoke still rose from where her plane had crashed. In front of her, the wilderness stretched on forever. Sarah shouldered her pack and started walking. Back at Nellie's Air Force Base, confusion reigned in the operations center. The storm had scattered the training flight, and it had taken 30 minutes to account for 3 of the 4 planes. Captain Brennan and the other 2 pilots had made it back safely, though shaken. But Captain Sarah Mitchell was missing. Colonel Thomas Hargrove stood in front of the radar displays, his jaw tight with worry. He was 55 years old, with gray hair and the weathered face of a man who had spent his life in the military. He had known Sarah for 8 years, had watched her become one of the finest pilots in his command. "What's the last position we have on Viper 1?" he demanded. "Sir, her transponder went offline approximately 70 miles northwest of here," a young radar operator reported. "Based on wind patterns and her last known heading, she could be anywhere in a 50-mile radius." "Get search and rescue in the air as soon as this storm clears," Hargrove ordered. "I want every available asset looking for her." Captain Brennan stepped forward. He had changed out of his flight suit and held a cup of coffee, looking far too relaxed for someone whose flight leader was missing. "Sir, with all due respect," Brennan said, "by the time the storm clears, it'll be dark, and if she went down in the mountains like we think, the chances of survival are pretty slim. Maybe we should wait until morning to launch a full search." Hargrove turned on him, his eyes flashing with anger. "Captain Mitchell is one of my pilots, and she is out there right now, alive, waiting for us to find her. We will launch search and rescue the second it's safe to fly. Is that clear?" "Yes, sir," Brennan said, but there was a smirk on his face that made Hargrove's blood boil. The hours crawled by. The storm finally began to clear around sunset, but by then it was too dangerous to send helicopters into the mountains. Search and rescue would have to wait until dawn. Hargrove stood at the window of his office, staring out at the darkening sky. Somewhere out there, Sarah was fighting to survive. He knew her well enough to know that she wouldn't give up. She was tough, resourceful, and determined. But even the toughest pilot could only survive so long in the wilderness alone. "Hang on, Sarah," he whispered to the empty room. "Just hang on." Sarah's fingers were numb inside her gloves as she gathered branches for a fire. The temperature had dropped below freezing, and the wind cut through her flight suit like it was made of paper. The survival training had taught her to build a shelter first, fire second, but she needed warmth now. She could feel hypothermia creeping in at the edges, making her thoughts fuzzy and her movements slow. She found a small overhang of rock that offered some protection from the wind. It wasn't much, just a shallow cave barely deep enough to crouch in, but it would keep the worst of the weather off her back. Sarah cleared the snow from the ground and arranged her kindling in a small pile. Her survival kit included waterproof matches and a magnesium fire starter, thank God. Her hands shook as she struck the match. The first 3 matches went out in the wind. The fourth one caught, and a tiny flame licked at the dry bark she had shredded with her knife. Sarah cupped her hands around it, protecting it like a newborn baby, breathing gently to feed it oxygen without blowing it out. The flame grew, catching on twigs, then larger branches, until she had a real fire crackling in front of her. The warmth was like a blessing from heaven. Sarah held her hands over the flames, feeling the blood start to flow back into her fingers. The pain of returning circulation made her wince, but it was a good pain. It meant she was still alive, still fighting. She pulled out her survival radio and tried again to make contact. Nothing but static. The GPS beacon was still dead. She was completely cut off from the outside world. Sarah forced herself to think logically to push down the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. What did she have? One survival kit with basic supplies, her sidearm with 2 full magazines, a couple of protein bars and a water purification kit, a knife, a small first aid kit, and the clothes on her back. What did she need? Rescue. But rescue couldn't come until someone knew where she was and her beacon wasn't working. That meant she had 2 choices: stay put and hope someone found the crash site, or start walking toward civilization. Staying put was usually the smart choice. Moving around made it harder for rescuers to find you. But Sarah had seen the terrain from the air before she ejected. She was deep in the wilderness, miles from any road or town. The crash site was probably impossible to reach on foot, buried in thick forest. And with the storm still dumping snow on the mountains, any tracks she might leave would be covered within hours. She would have to walk out. Sarah pulled out the map from her survival kit and studied it by firelight. It was a basic topographical map of Nevada and the surrounding areas, not detailed enough to pinpoint her exact location, but it gave her a general idea. If the storm had pushed her northwest, she was probably somewhere in the Sierra Nevada range, maybe even across the border into California. The nearest town would be, she traced her finger across the map, at least 30 or 40 miles away, through some of the roughest terrain in the country. 30 or 40 miles might as well have been 1,000. In this cold, with limited supplies, it would take days, maybe a week if the weather stayed bad. But Sarah Mitchell had not survived this long by doubting herself. She would start at first light, Head downhill following the drainage patterns. Water always led to civilization eventually. Stay warm, stay moving, and stay alive. Simple as that. The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks spiraling into the dark sky. Sarah pulled her parachute out of her pack and wrapped it around her shoulders like a blanket. It wasn't made for warmth, but the multiple layers of fabric helped block the wind. She leaned back against the rock and allowed herself to close her eyes for just a moment. Her thoughts drifted back to Nellie's, to the briefing room and the smug look on Jake Brennan's face. She wondered if they were looking for her yet. She wondered if Brennan was out there right now, leading a search party, or if he was back at the base telling everyone that she had finally screwed up, that she had proven she was too old for the job. The anger that flared up surprised her with its intensity. She had spent years trying not to care what people like Brennan thought. She had focused on doing her job, being the best pilot she could be, proving herself through actions rather than words. But deep down, in a place she didn't like to admit existed, their mockery hurt. Every snide comment, every dismissive look, every time she walked into a room and felt the eyes on her, judging her, waiting for her to fail. Well, she hadn't failed. The engine had failed. The weather had failed. But Sarah Mitchell was still here, still breathing, still fighting. And she would make it back to base if it killed her just to see the look on Brennan's face when she walked through that door. The thought made her smile, even though her lips were cracked and bleeding from the cold. Sarah forced herself to eat one of the protein bars, even though she wasn't hungry. Her body needed fuel to stay warm. She melted snow in her canteen and drank the water, careful not to drink too much too fast. Dehydration was just as dangerous as hypothermia out here. The night stretched on forever. The fire burned down to coals, and Sarah added more wood, keeping it small and controlled. A big fire would burn through her fuel too quickly, and she needed to save energy for tomorrow. The wind howled through the trees, and somewhere in the distance, she heard what sounded like a wolf howling, or maybe it was just her imagination. She dozed fitfully, jerking awake every few minutes as the cold seeped through her makeshift shelter. Her dreams were full of falling, of engines exploding, of Jake Brennan's mocking laughter echoing through empty hangars. When the first gray light of dawn finally crept over the mountains, Sarah had never been so glad to see morning in her life. She stood up, wincing as her stiff muscles protested. Everything hurt. Her back ached from sleeping on the hard ground. Her hands were blistered from gathering firewood. Her feet felt like blocks of ice inside her boots. But she was alive, and that was what mattered. Sarah kicked dirt over the remains of her fire and shouldered her pack. The sun was just peeking over the eastern ridge, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of pink and gold. It would have been beautiful if she weren't fighting for her life. She oriented herself using the sun and started walking downhill. The going was brutal from the start. The snow was knee-deep in places, and the terrain was a nightmare of fallen logs and hidden rocks. Sarah fell a dozen times in the first hour, catching herself on her hands, feeling the impact jar through her wrists and shoulders. But she kept getting up, kept moving forward, one step at a time. By midday, she had made maybe 3 miles out of 30. At this rate, it would take her 10 days to reach civilization, and she didn't have supplies for 10 days. She had 2 protein bars left and maybe half a canteen of water. Sarah pushed the thought away. Worrying about what she didn't have was pointless. She focused on what she did have, her training, her determination, and her refusal to die in these mountains. She took a short break at the top of a ridge, scanning the valley below for any sign of human activity. A road, a cabin, a power line, anything. But there was nothing except more trees and more snow. The radio crackled suddenly, making her jump. Sarah yanked it out of her pack and held it to her ear. The static resolved for just a moment into a voice, too garbled to understand, then faded back into noise. But it was something. It meant she was getting closer to civilization, closer to help. Or maybe it was a rescue plane searching for her. Sarah keyed the transmit button. "This is Captain Sarah Mitchell, U.S. Air Force, to any station. I am down in the mountains, approximately 30 miles northwest of Nellie's Air Force Base. I am mobile and heading east. Please respond." She released the button and waited. Static was the only answer, but she tried again, repeating the message, and again until her voice was hoarse. "Nothing." Sarah clipped the radio to her belt, where she could reach it quickly, and started walking again. The afternoon brought new challenges. The terrain grew steeper, forcing her to pick her way carefully down rocky slopes. Once her foot slipped on ice, and she slid 20 feet before managing to grab a tree root and stop herself. She lay there for a moment, heart pounding, staring at the 50-foot drop just beyond where she had stopped. That was close, too close. She found a stream as the sun started to sink toward the horizon. The water was ice cold and crystal clear, flowing over smooth rocks. Sarah filled her canteen and dropped in a purification tablet, then drank deeply. The water was so cold it made her teeth ache, but it tasted like life itself. She wanted to keep moving, to put more distance between herself and the crash site, but darkness was coming fast. Sarah found another sheltered spot, this time under a massive fallen tree that created a natural lean-to. She gathered firewood and built another small fire, rationing her matches carefully. 2 matches left after tonight. As she huddled by the fire, eating her second-to-last protein bar, Sarah thought about her life. She was 41 years old and single, married only to her career. Her parents were gone, both passed away within a year of each other when she was in her 30s. She had a brother in Oregon, but they hadn't spoken in years, not since their argument about their parents' estate. There was no one waiting for her at home. No husband, no kids, no pets, just an empty apartment on base and a closet full of uniforms. Was this how it ended? Alone in the mountains, freezing to death, with no one to mourn her except maybe Colonel Hargrove and a handful of fellow pilots who would raise a glass in her memory and then move on with their lives. Sarah shook her head violently, angry at herself for the spiral of self-pity. She was not going to die here. She was going to walk out of these mountains, and she was going to make everyone who doubted her eat their words. The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks into the air. Sarah watched them rise and fade like tiny stars dying. She thought about all the times she had been told she couldn't do something. When she joined the Air Force and the recruiter suggested she consider a support role instead of pilot training. When she applied to fly A-10s and was told that women didn't have the upper body strength for the stick forces. When she deployed to combat zones and was given easier missions than her male counterparts, assigned to milk runs while they got the glory. She had proven them wrong every single time. This would be no different. Sarah lay down on the cold ground, wrapped in her parachute, and forced herself to sleep. Tomorrow would be another hard day, and she needed rest. The dreams came again, but this time, mixed in with the nightmares of falling and burning, there were other images. Her first solo flight, the rush of adrenaline and joy as she took the controls alone for the first time. Her first combat mission, the terror and pride mixing together as she dove on an enemy position. The faces of soldiers on the ground, looking up at her plane with gratitude and relief because they knew she was there to protect them. She had saved lives. She had made a difference. Whatever else happened, no one could take that away from her. When Sarah opened her eyes, it was still dark, but something had changed. The wind had died down. The air felt different, warmer somehow. And there was a sound in the distance, faint but unmistakable. A helicopter. Sarah bolted upright, grabbing her radio. The sound was coming from the south, back the way she had come. They were searching the area around the crash site. "This is Captain Sarah Mitchell," she shouted into the radio. "I am approximately 5 miles east of the crash site in a valley following a stream. I have a fire. Do you copy?" "Static." The helicopter sound faded, moving away from her. "No, no, no," Sarah muttered. She grabbed a branch from her fire and waved it over her head, knowing it was pointless. They were too far away to see a small fire in the darkness, but she had to try. The sound disappeared completely. The silence that followed was crushing. Sarah sank back down, fighting tears of frustration. They had been so close. If her radio worked, if the beacon worked, if she had just been a little closer to the crash site. But if didn't matter, all that mattered was survival. Sarah fed the fire and waited for dawn. By the 3rd day, Sarah's situation had become desperate. Her last protein bar was gone. The only water she had was from the streams she passed, purified with tablets she was running dangerously low on. Her feet were covered in blisters that had torn open and bled into her socks. Every step was agony, but she kept walking. The terrain had finally started to level out. She was out of the high mountains now, moving through foothills covered in pine and scrub brush. That was good. It meant she was getting closer to civilization, but it also meant she had farther to walk before she found it. Sarah had lost track of the miles. 10, maybe 12 since she started. Less than halfway to safety, and her body was starting to shut down. The cold had settled into her bones and no amount of moving could shake it. Her hands trembled constantly. Her thoughts came slower, fuzzy around the edges. Hypothermia, starvation, exhaustion, pick your poison. She talked to herself as she walked, forcing her mind to stay active. She recited regulations from memory, the technical specifications of the A-10, the emergency procedures she had practiced 1,000 times. Anything to keep her brain working. "The A-10 Thunderbolt II," she said aloud, her voice cracking from thirst and cold, "has a maximum speed of 420 knots, combat radius of 250 nautical miles. Armament includes one GAU-8 Avenger 30mm rotary cannon with 1,150 rounds. Her voice trailed off. What did any of that matter now? She wasn't in a plane. She was stumbling through the wilderness, slowly dying, and no one was coming to save her. Sarah stopped walking and leaned against a tree, breathing hard. Her vision swam. The world tilted and spun like she was in an uncontrolled roll. "Get it together, Mitchell," she told herself. "You don't get to quit." But her body had other ideas. Her legs buckled and she slid down the tree trunk to sit in the snow. Just for a minute, just to rest. The temptation to close her eyes was overwhelming. Sleep sounded so good. Just a little nap and then she would get up and keep walking. Sarah's head nodded forward. A sound jerked her awake, a low rumble, deep and powerful, coming from somewhere above. Sarah's pilot instincts kicked in before her conscious mind caught up. She knew that sound. She knew it in her bones. An A-10. Her A-10, not the one she had crashed, but another from her squadron. The distinctive turbofan whine of the twin General Electric engines, the sound she had lived with for 12 years, was unmistakable. Sarah scrambled to her feet, ignoring the protests from her battered body. She looked up at the sky, scanning the clouds desperately. There, a dark shape flying a search pattern maybe a mile to the south. She grabbed her radio and keyed the transmit button, her frozen fingers fumbling with the controls. "This is Captain Mitchell to any Air Force aircraft. I am on the ground, 5 miles east of the crash site. Can you hear me?" The A-10 continued its pattern, showing no sign of having heard her transmission. Sarah looked around frantically. She needed something, anything, to signal with. The radio wasn't working at long range, and waving her arms was pointless. Then she remembered the flare gun in her survival kit. She had been saving it, afraid to waste the one flare she had. But this was exactly what it was for. Sarah dug through her pack with shaking hands and pulled out the small emergency flare gun. It was orange plastic, barely bigger than her palm, with a single 12-gauge flare cartridge loaded. One shot, one chance. She pointed it at the sky and pulled the trigger. The flare arced up in a brilliant red streak, trailing smoke, climbing high above the trees. It burned like a tiny sun against the gray clouds, impossible to miss. The A-10 banked hard to the left, turning toward her position. Sarah's heart soared. They had seen it. They knew she was here. The plane dropped lower, coming in over the valley where she stood. Sarah could see the pilot now, just a silhouette in the canopy, but she waved her arms anyway, jumping up and down despite her exhaustion. The A-10 made a low pass directly overhead, maybe 200 feet up. The roar of the engines washed over her, and for a moment Sarah was back in the cockpit where she belonged, master of the sky instead of victim of the ground. She keyed the radio again. "I see you, I'm here." This time a voice crackled back through the static. "Mitchell, confirm your position." "I'm in a valley following a stream east," Sarah shouted into the radio. "I can keep moving, but I need food and water. Can you drop supplies?" More static then. "Negative on supply drop. Terrain too rough. Rescue helicopter inbound. Estimate 30 minutes. 30 minutes? She could last 30 more minutes. She had lasted 3 days. What was 30 more minutes? "Roger that," Sarah said, and her voice broke with relief and exhaustion. "I'll be here." The made another pass, waggling its wings in acknowledgement, then climbed back up to altitude to circle overhead. Sarah watched it go, and for the first time since the engine had exploded, she felt like things were going to be okay. She sat down in the snow to wait, no longer worried about falling asleep. Help was coming. But back at Nellie's Air Force Base, a different conversation was taking place. Colonel Hargrove stood in his office, phone pressed to his ear, his face growing redder by the second. On the other end of the line was a Pentagon bureaucrat with a clipboard and a complete lack of understanding about military operations. "What do you mean I need to justify the rescue cost?" Hargrove demanded. "We have a pilot down in the field. We don't just leave people out there because it's expensive." The bureaucrat's voice droned on, talking about budget constraints and cost-benefit analyses, and the fact that Captain Mitchell had already survived 3 days. So maybe she could walk out on her own and save the Air Force the expense of a helicopter rescue. "That is the most asinine thing I have ever heard," Hargrove snapped. "Captain Mitchell is a decorated combat veteran with 12 years of service. We do not abandon our people." More droning, something about priorities and resources being needed elsewhere. Hargrove slammed the phone down and turned to find Captain Jake Brennan standing in his doorway, holding a tablet. "Sir, if I could have a moment." "Not now, Brennan." "Sir, it's about Captain Mitchell." Brennan stepped into the office, his expression serious. "I've been reviewing the flight data from the training mission, and I think you should see this." Hargrove took the tablet and looked at the data. It showed the flight paths of all 4 aircraft, the weather patterns, the timeline of events. "I don't see anything unusual here," Hargrove said. "Look at Captain Mitchell's altitude and heading before she lost contact," Brennan said, pointing to the screen. "She climbed into the storm instead of descending below it like the rest of us. That's poor judgment, sir. If she had followed proper procedure, she would have avoided the worst of the turbulence and probably the engine failure." Hargrove looked at the younger pilot with barely concealed disgust. "Are you seriously trying to blame Captain Mitchell for a mechanical failure?" "I'm saying that her decision-making may have contributed to the situation," Brennan said. "And given her age and the fact that she's been showing signs of declining performance, maybe this incident is evidence that she should have been grounded months ago." "Get out of my office." "Sir." "That's an order, Captain. Get out before I have you removed." Brennan left, but the satisfied look on his face made Hargrove want to punch something. The bastard was already building a narrative, covering his own ass by throwing Sarah under the bus. And if the Pentagon was looking for reasons to cut costs, they might just listen to him. Hargrove picked up the phone again and dialed the search and rescue coordinator. "What's the status on Captain Mitchell's rescue?" "Sir, we have a helicopter en route. ETA is 25 minutes. "Good, and make it clear that this rescue happens no matter what any pencil pusher in Washington says. We take care of our own." "Yes, sir." Hargrove hung up and looked out the window at the flight line. In the distance, he could see an, returning from its search pattern, probably the one that had just spotted Sarah. 12 years she had flown those planes. 12 years of distinguished service, combat missions, lives saved. And now Brennan and the bean counters wanted to use her survival as evidence that she was past her prime. It made him sick. But Hargrove knew how the game was played. If Sarah made it back when she made it back, she would face an investigation. There would be questions about her judgment, her performance, her fitness for duty. And men like Brennan would be there every step of the way, whispering in ears, planting doubts. Unless Sarah had something to say about it. Hargrove smiled grimly. If there was one thing he knew about Sarah Mitchell, it was that she didn't go down without a fight. She had survived 3 days in the wilderness against impossible odds. Whatever came next, she would survive that too. The helicopter was a beautiful sight. Sarah heard it before she saw it, the distinctive whop-whop-whop of rotor blades cutting through the air. Then it appeared over the ridge, a massive HH-60 Pave Hawk painted in Air Force gray, with a crew chief visible in the side door. The helicopter circled once, the pilot assessing the landing zone, then came in low. The rotor wash kicked up snow and dead leaves, creating a whirlwind around Sarah. She shielded her eyes and stayed low until the skids touched down. 2 pararescue men jumped out, carrying medical gear. They reached Sarah in seconds, their hands gentle but efficient as they checked her vital signs. "How you doing, ma'am?" one of them asked. He was young, maybe 25, with kind eyes behind his goggles. "I've been better," Sarah said and managed a weak smile. "But I'm alive." "That you are, let's keep it that way." They wrapped her in a thermal blanket and helped her to the helicopter. Sarah's legs felt like rubber, and she probably would have collapsed if they weren't supporting her. But she made it to the bird, and that was what counted. Inside, the crew chief handed her a bottle of water and a meal bar. Sarah's hands shook so badly she could barely open the wrapper, so the crew chief did it for her and broke off small pieces she could eat without choking. The helicopter lifted off, banking away from the valley. Through the window, Sarah could see the wilderness that had almost killed her spread out below. From up here it looked peaceful and beautiful, the snow-covered trees like a Christmas card. But she knew better. She knew what it was like down there in the cold and the dark. The flight back to Nellie's took an hour. Sarah dozed most of the way, warm for the first time in days, her body finally able to relax. The pararescue men monitored her, checking her temperature and heart rate, but they let her rest. When they touched down at the base hospital, there was a crowd waiting. Medical personnel with a gurney, ready to rush her into treatment. But there was also a group of pilots, still in their flight suits, who had come to see her brought home. Colonel Hargrove pushed through the crowd and climbed into the helicopter before anyone could stop him. "Welcome back, Captain," he said. "Good to be back, sir," Sarah replied. Her voice was barely a whisper, but she was smiling. "The doctors are going to take care of you now. Don't worry about anything else." "Sir, my plane is insured, and you followed procedure perfectly. Don't let anyone tell you different." There was something in his tone that made Sarah pause. "Sir, we'll talk when you're recovered. Right now, you just focus on getting better." They loaded her onto the gurney and wheeled her into the hospital. Sarah caught glimpses of faces in the crowd, some friendly, some neutral. And there, standing at the back, was Captain Jake Brennan, his expression unreadable. She was too tired to care what he thought. She was alive, she was home, everything else could wait. Part 4, the investigation. The hospital room was sterile and white, with machines beeping softly and the smell of disinfectant in the air. Sarah had been there for 2 days, recovering from exposure, dehydration, and exhaustion. The doctors said she was lucky. Another day in the wilderness and she might not have made it. But luck was a funny thing. It could save your life one day and destroy it the next. Sarah sat propped up in bed, an IV in her arm and heated blankets piled on top of her. Her feet were wrapped in bandages from the blisters and frostbite. Her hands were covered in ointment for the cuts and scrapes. But she was alive, and the doctors said she would make a full recovery. The door opened and Colonel Hargrove walked in holding a folder. His expression was grim. "How are you feeling, Sarah?" he asked, pulling up a chair beside her bed. "Like I got hit by a truck, sir, but I'll live." "That you will." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "I need to talk to you about what happens next." Sarah's stomach tightened. She had known this was coming. There was always an investigation after an incident like this. The Air Force needed to know what went wrong, whose fault it was, whether procedures were followed. "There's going to be a formal inquiry into the engine failure and your ejection," Hargrove said. "Standard procedure. The NTSB will investigate the mechanical failure and will do an internal review of the mission planning and execution." "I understand, sir." "The problem is," Hargrove hesitated again, and Sarah knew she wasn't going to like what came next. "Captain Brennan has filed a report suggesting that you showed poor judgment during the mission. He claims you climbed into the storm instead of descending below it, and that decision may have contributed to the engine failure." Sarah felt anger surge through her, hot and immediate. "That's garbage, sir. The storm came up faster than predicted. I made the decision to climb based on the information I had at the time. Standard procedure for dealing with rapidly developing weather." "I know that, and the investigation will show that. But Brennan's report has gotten attention. Combined with some concerns about cost management from Washington, there are people asking questions about whether this incident represents a pattern of declining performance." "Declining performance?" Sarah's voice rose despite herself. "Sir, I have 12 years of unblemished service. My flight reviews are all excellent. I've flown more combat missions than half the pilots on this base combined." "I know, but you're also 41 years old, which makes you one of the oldest active combat pilots in the Air Force. And there are people who think maybe it's time for you to transition to a desk job." There it was, the thing she had been fighting against for years, the whispered conversations and pointed looks finally crystallizing into official policy. "Permission to speak freely, sir." "Granted." "This is bullshit." Sarah locked eyes with Hargrove. "If I were a 30-year-old male pilot, no one would question whether I should still be flying. But because I'm a woman over 40, suddenly every decision I make is suspect. I didn't cause that engine to fail. I survived 3 days in the wilderness and walked out under my own power. If anything, this incident proves I'm exactly the kind of pilot the Air Force should want." Hargrove nodded slowly. I agree with you, but I'm not the one you need to convince. The inquiry board will make the final determination about your flight status. When? The hearing is scheduled for next week. You'll have a chance to present your side of the story. I'll be there to support you, and your service record speaks for itself. But you should be prepared for tough questions. Sarah leaned back against her pillows, exhausted by the brief conversation. What happens if they ground me, sir? Then you'll have options. You could take a position in training command or operations planning, or any number of other roles where your experience would be valuable. Flying a desk. It's an honorable career path. It's not what I want. Sarah looked out the window at the flight line visible in the distance. She could see planes taking off and landing, hear the faint roar of engines. I'm not ready to give up the stick, sir. Then don't fight for it. Hargrove stood up and put a hand on her shoulder. You've overcome every obstacle they've thrown at you for 12 years. This is just one more, and for what it's worth, I believe in you. After he left, Sarah lay in bed and stared at the ceiling, her mind racing. She had always known this day might come, but she had thought she would have more time. She had imagined retiring on her own terms when she was ready, not being forced out because of other people's prejudices. But maybe that had been naive. The military was changing, becoming more inclusive, but old attitudes died hard. There were still plenty of men like Brennan who thought women had no place in the cockpit, who looked for any excuse to prove they were right. Well, she would show them. She would go to that hearing and defend herself with everything she had. And when it was over, she would get back in the cockpit where she belonged. A nurse came in to check her vitals, and Sarah forced herself to smile and be pleasant. She ate the terrible hospital food they brought her. She did the physical therapy exercises to regain strength in her legs. She prepared for war because that's what this was. A different kind of war than she was used to, but a war nonetheless. The next few days passed in a blur of medical tests and paperwork. The NTSB investigators came to interview her about the engine failure. They were professional and thorough, showing her maintenance records and asking detailed questions about what she had observed in the cockpit. Sarah answered honestly, describing the vibration, the fire warnings, the decision to shut down the engine and activate the suppression system. Based on our preliminary investigation, the lead investigator told her, there was a fatigue crack in the high-pressure turbine disc. It should have been caught during the last maintenance inspection, but it was missed. The storm stress accelerated the failure, but it would have happened eventually regardless of flight conditions. So it wasn't caused by my flight profile. No, Captain, you couldn't have prevented this, and your emergency response was textbook. The fact that you maintained control long enough to eject safely is a credit to your skill. That was something, at least. The NTSB's findings would be part of the official record, which meant Brennan's accusations about poor judgment were baseless. But Sarah knew it wouldn't be enough. The inquiry wasn't really about the engine failure. It was about whether she was still fit to fly, and no amount of technical data would settle that question. It came down to perceptions and politics and the biases of whoever sat on the board. On the day before her hearing, Sarah was finally cleared to leave the hospital. She walked out on her own, wearing a fresh uniform that Colonel Hargrove had brought her. Her feet still hurt, and she was weaker than she liked, but she could move under her own power. That was what mattered. A car was waiting to take her back to her quarters. As they drove through the base, Sarah looked out at the familiar sights. The flight line, the hangars, the operations buildings where she had spent so many hours planning missions and debriefing flights. This was her home, more than any apartment or house had ever been. She couldn't lose it, she wouldn't. That night, Sarah prepared for the hearing like she would prepare for a combat mission. She reviewed the regulations, the flight data, every detail of what had happened that day. She practiced her testimony, anticipating hostile questions and preparing responses. She laid out her dress uniform, making sure every ribbon and badge was positioned correctly, every crease sharp. When she finally lay down to sleep, her mind was still racing, but she felt ready. Whatever came tomorrow, she would face it head-on, the same way she faced everything else. The inquiry board convened at 0900 hours in a conference room at base headquarters. The board consisted of 3 senior officers, a 2-star general from Air Combat Command, a colonel from the safety board, and a full bird colonel who specialized in pilot training and readiness. Sarah stood at attention as they entered, her back straight and her gaze level. She had faced enemy fire and natural disasters. She could face this. The general, a man named Morrison with steel-gray hair and a chest full of ribbons, took his seat at the head of the table and looked at Sarah with an expression that gave nothing away. "Captain Mitchell, please be seated," he said. "This is an informal inquiry, not a court-martial. We're here to review the circumstances of your recent emergency and determine whether any changes to policy or procedures are warranted. You are not accused of any wrongdoing." Sarah sat down, her hands folded in her lap. "Thank you, sir." "Let's begin with your account of what happened on the day in question." Sarah had told this story a dozen times already, but she told it again, clearly and precisely. The mission briefing, the weather that came up faster than predicted, the engine failure, her decision to eject, the 3 days in the wilderness. The board members listened without interrupting, taking notes. When she finished, the general nodded. "Thank you, Captain. Now, we've also heard testimony from Captain Brennan, who was flying as Viper 3 that day. He has suggested that your decision to climb into the storm rather than descend below it was a deviation from standard procedure and may have contributed to the severity of the situation. How do you respond to that?" Sarah kept her voice calm and professional. "Sir, when rapidly developing weather is encountered, the flight lead has discretion to either climb above or descend below the weather based on their assessment of the situation. I chose to climb because the cloud bases appeared to be lower than our altitude, and descending into unknown terrain in poor visibility would have been more dangerous. My decision was within procedure and based on the best information available at the time." "The NTSB report supports Captain Mitchell's account," the colonel from the safety board interjected. "The engine failure was caused by a maintenance issue, not by flight stress, and her emergency procedures were by the book." "Noted," General Morrison said. He looked at Sarah again. "Captain, you've been flying A-10s for 12 years. You're 41 years old. In your honest assessment, do you feel you're still capable of performing at the level required for combat operations?" There it was, the real question behind this entire inquiry. Sarah met his gaze without flinching. "Yes, sir, I do. My flight physicals are all current and within standards. My flight reviews are excellent. I've maintained proficiency in all required areas. And I would point out that I survived 3 days in the wilderness in winter conditions, navigated on foot through rough terrain, and made my own rescue possible by using my survival training effectively. If anything, this incident demonstrates my capability under extreme stress." "That's a fair point," the training colonel said. "I've reviewed your file, Captain. Your record is exemplary. But there's a broader question here about age and reflexes. The Air Force has to consider whether pilots over a certain age represent an increased risk." "With respect, sir," Sarah said, "experience counts for something. I've flown missions that younger pilots haven't. I've dealt with situations they haven't encountered. Yes, maybe my reflexes are a fraction of a second slower than a 25-year-old, but I make up for it with judgment and knowledge. The Air Force invests millions of dollars training pilots. It seems wasteful to push out experienced aviators who are still fully capable of doing the job." The room was quiet for a moment, then the general stood up. "Thank you for your testimony, Captain Mitchell. The board will deliberate and deliver our findings within 48 hours. You're dismissed." Sarah stood, saluted, and walked out of the room with her head high. But inside, she was terrified. The hearing had been professional and fair, but she had no idea which way the board would lean. They could clear her completely, ground her temporarily for more evaluation, or recommend permanent reassignment to non-flying duties. The 48 hours stretched into an eternity. Sarah tried to stay busy, working out in the gym despite her still healing injuries, catching up on paperwork, anything to keep her mind off the waiting. But every time she heard footsteps in the hallway or her phone buzzed, her heart jumped into her throat. Other pilots stopped by to offer support. Some were genuine, telling her they were pulling for her. Others were curious, wanting to hear the story firsthand. And a few, the ones who had always resented her presence in their ranks, stayed conspicuously silent. Captain Brennan fell into the third category. Sarah saw him once in the hallway, and he had the decency to look uncomfortable. But he didn't apologize for his report, and she didn't expect him to. Men like Brennan never admitted they were wrong. On the morning of the second day, Colonel Hargrove called her to his office. Sarah walked across the base with her stomach in knots. This was it. The board had made their decision, and Hargrove was going to deliver it. She tried to read his expression as she entered the office, but his face was neutral. "Sit down, Sarah," he said. She sat, her back straight, her hands clenched in her lap. Hargrove picked up a document from his desk and looked at it for a long moment before speaking. The inquiry board has completed their deliberation. The good news is that you've been cleared of any wrongdoing in the incident. The NTSB report confirms that the engine failure was due to a maintenance issue, and your emergency procedures were executed correctly. Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her. Thank you, sir. However, Hargrove continued, and her relief evaporated, the board has recommended that you be temporarily grounded pending a comprehensive fitness evaluation. They want you to undergo additional flight physicals and simulator testing to assess your current capabilities. How long will that take? 4 to 6 weeks minimum, and Sarah, he hesitated. The board's recommendation isn't binding. I have the authority to override it and return you to flight status immediately. But if I do that and something happens, another incident, even something completely unrelated to your performance, it'll reflect badly on both of us. The safer course is to let you go through the evaluation. Sarah felt like she had been punched in the gut. Sir, with respect, this is exactly what Brennan wanted. He files a bogus report, plants doubt in everyone's mind, and now I'm grounded based on nothing but age discrimination. I know, and I don't like it any more than you do. But we have to play the game, Sarah. Go through the evaluation, ace every test, and come back with documentation that proves beyond any doubt that you're fit for duty. Then no one can question it. And if I refuse, if I demand to be reinstated immediately, then you'll make enemies, and those enemies will be watching you like hawks, waiting for you to slip up. Is that really what you want? Sarah wanted to argue. She wanted to slam her fist on the desk and demand the justice she deserved. But Hargrove was right. This wasn't about what was fair. It was about politics and perception and playing the long game. Fine, she said. I'll do the evaluation. But, sir, I want it on record that I believe this is discriminatory and that I'm only agreeing under protest. Noted, and Sarah, for what it's worth, I think you're one of the best pilots I've ever served with. Don't let them take that away from you. Sarah stood up and saluted. I won't, sir. She walked out of the office feeling numb, grounded. The word echoed in her head like a death sentence. She was still in the Air Force, still getting paid, still technically a pilot. But she wasn't flying. And for someone who had defined herself by flying for the past 12 years, being grounded felt like being erased. The next few weeks were a special kind of hell. Sarah underwent every test and evaluation the medical staff could think of. She ran on treadmills with electrodes attached to her chest. She sat in dark rooms while they measured her reaction times and peripheral vision. She spent hours in simulators, flying mock emergencies, and being graded on every decision. And through it all, she knew that people were watching her, judging her, waiting to see if she would crack under the pressure. Captain Brennan made sure to be in the simulator bay one afternoon when Sarah was running through emergency procedures. He stood in the observation room with his arms crossed, watching her through the glass like she was a specimen under a microscope. Sarah ignored him and focused on the simulation. Engine fire. She went through the checklist, shutting down the affected engine, activating suppression, maintaining control. The simulator threw complication after complication at her, hydraulic failure, electrical problems, loss of avionics, and she handled each one calmly and efficiently. When she finally climbed out of the simulator, sweating and exhausted, Brennan was still there. Not bad for an old-timer, he said with a smirk. Maybe they'll let you fly a desk after this. Sarah looked at him with pure contempt. You know what your problem is, Brennan? You're so insecure about your own abilities that you have to tear down everyone around you. I survived 3 days in the wilderness because I know how to adapt and overcome. You'd have died on the first night, crying for your mother. His smirk disappeared. Watch yourself, Captain. Or what, you'll file another bogus report? Go ahead. I'm done caring what you think. She walked past him without another word, her head held high. But that night, alone in her quarters, Sarah broke down. She sat on the edge of her bed and cried for the first time since the whole ordeal began. Not because of Brennan's mockery or the unfairness of the evaluation or even the fear that she might lose her wings. She cried because she was tired. Tired of fighting, tired of proving herself, tired of being strong all the time. She had given the Air Force everything. 12 years of her life, her youth, her relationships, her health. She had flown into harm's way again and again, trusting that the institution would have her back when she needed it. But instead, the institution was crushing her under its weight, grinding her down, trying to force her out because she didn't fit the mold anymore. Sarah wiped her eyes and took a deep breath. She allowed herself 5 minutes of self-pity, and then she locked it away. Crying wouldn't change anything. The only thing that would change her situation was to keep fighting, keep pushing, keep proving that she belonged. The evaluation dragged on for 5 weeks. Finally, Sarah was called back to Colonel Hargrove's office to receive the results. She walked in with her heart pounding, expecting the worst. Hargrove stood up as she entered, and he was smiling. "The results are in," he said. "You passed every single test with flying colors. Reaction times, decision-making, physical fitness, all within acceptable parameters for active flight status. Several of the evaluators noted that your experience and judgment actually gave you an advantage over younger pilots in complex scenarios." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes, but these were tears of relief. "So I'm cleared to fly." "You're cleared. Welcome back, Captain." She couldn't help it. She smiled so wide her face hurt. "Thank you, sir. When can I get back in the air?" "How about tomorrow? We've got a training flight scheduled, and I think you'd be perfect as flight lead." "I'll be ready." Sarah left the office walking on air. She had done it. She had faced down the doubt and the discrimination and the bureaucracy, and she had won. She was going back to the cockpit. That night, she celebrated with a few close friends at the officers' club. Colonel Hargrove bought her a drink and raised a toast. "To Captain Mitchell," he said, "who reminds us all that skill and determination matter more than age or politics." Everyone drank, and Sarah felt a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the alcohol. These were her people. This was her home, and nothing was going to take it away from her. But the next morning, everything changed. Sarah arrived at the flight line at 0600 hours, ready for her first flight in over a month. She had her gear, her flight plan, her aircraft pre-checked and ready. She was practically vibrating with excitement as she walked toward her plane. Then Colonel Hargrove came running across the tarmac, waving for her to stop. "Sarah, wait," he called out. She turned confused. "Sir, what's wrong?" Hargrove reached her, breathing hard. His face was pale. "I just got a call from Air Combat Command. There's been a development." "What kind of development?" "Captain Brennan filed a formal complaint with the Inspector General. He's alleging that you received preferential treatment during the evaluation, that the results were influenced by my support for you, and that your reinstatement represents a breakdown in objective standards." Sarah felt the world tilt. "That's insane. The evaluation was conducted by independent medical personnel. You weren't even in the room." "I know, but the IG has to investigate the complaint, and until the investigation is complete, they're suspending your flight status again." "No," Sarah shook her head violently. "No, this is wrong. He's just doing this to harass me, to punish me for standing up to him." "I agree, but my hands are tied. I'm sorry, Sarah." Sarah looked at her plane, sitting there on the tarmac, ready to fly. So close. She had been so close. "How long will the investigation take?" she asked, her voice hollow. "Could be weeks, could be months." Sarah closed her eyes and took a deep breath, then another, and another. When she opened them, her jaw was set with determination. "Fine," she said. "If they want to investigate, let them investigate. I'll cooperate fully. But, sir, this has to stop. Brennan can't be allowed to keep doing this." "I'll handle Brennan," Hargrove said grimly. "That's a promise." But as Sarah walked away from the flight line, her gear still on and her plane still waiting, she knew that promises weren't enough anymore. Something had to change, and she was going to be the one to change it. Part 6, Thunder from Above. 2 months later, Sarah sat in a small hearing room at Air Force Headquarters in Washington, D.C. The Inspector General's investigation had dragged on far longer than anyone expected. But finally, they were ready to present their findings. Sarah had spent those 2 months in limbo, still on active duty, still collecting a paycheck, but not flying. She had been assigned to work in operations planning, flying a desk just like she had feared. Every day, she watched other pilots take off and land, and every day, a piece of her soul died. Captain Brennan had been careful. His complaint to the IG was worded just vaguely enough to sound legitimate while being specific enough to trigger a full investigation. He alleged that Colonel Hargrove had pressured the evaluation team to pass Sarah regardless of her actual performance. He claimed to have concerns about command climate and objectivity in standards. It was all garbage, but it was effective garbage. The IG investigator, a stern woman named Colonel Davies, sat across from Sarah with a thick file in front of her. Colonel Hargrove sat beside Sarah, and the base legal officer sat on her other side. This wasn't a court-martial, but it felt like one. "Captain Mitchell," Colonel Davies began, "I've completed my investigation into Captain Brennan's allegations. I've reviewed the evaluation records, interviewed the medical personnel, and examined the processes used to assess your fitness for flight duty." Sarah's heart was in her throat. This was it. Her career, her entire life, hanging on whatever came next. "I find no evidence to support Captain Brennan's claims," Davies said, and Sarah felt like she could breathe again. "The evaluation was conducted by independent medical professionals using standard protocols. Your scores were documented and verified. There is no indication of preferential treatment or command influence." "Thank you, ma'am," Sarah said, her voice shaking slightly. "However," Davies continued, and Sarah's relief evaporated, "the investigation has raised broader concerns about the treatment of senior pilots and the perception of bias in fitness evaluations. As a result, Air Combat Command is implementing new policies regarding age-related fitness assessments for all pilots over the age of 40. Sarah felt cold. What kind of policies? Annual comprehensive evaluations instead of the current biannual standard, additional simulator testing, and mandatory transition planning meetings to discuss career options outside of active flight status. It was everything Sarah had feared. They were using her case to justify increased scrutiny of older pilots across the board. She had won her individual battle but lost the larger war. "With respect, ma'am," Sarah said carefully, "these policies seem discriminatory. They're based on age rather than actual performance metrics." "They're based on risk management, Captain. The Air Force has a responsibility to ensure flight safety." "And I have a responsibility to fight discrimination when I see it," Sarah replied. Her voice was stronger now, the anger giving her courage. "I am not a risk because of my age. I am an asset because of my experience, and these policies will drive experienced pilots out of the cockpit just when we need them most." Colonel Davies' expression softened slightly. "I understand your frustration, Captain, but the policies are not my decision to make. They come from the top." The meeting ended shortly after. Sarah was cleared to return to flight status, effective immediately. But the victory felt hollow. She had her wings back, but at what cost? That night back at Nellie's, Sarah sat in the officers' club nursing a beer. Colonel Hargrove found her there, looking as tired as she felt. "How are you holding up?" he asked, sliding into the seat across from her. "I don't know, sir. I got what I wanted. I'm flying again, but it feels like I lost." "You didn't lose. You exposed a system that needed fixing." "Did I? Or did I just make things worse for every older pilot in the Air Force?" Hargrove was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I have something to show you." He pulled out his phone and opened an email, then handed it to Sarah. It was from a captain she didn't know, stationed at a base in Germany. "Dear Colonel Hargrove," the email read, "I wanted to thank you and Captain Mitchell for fighting the good fight. I'm 43 years old and have been flying F-16s for 18 years. Last month, my squadron commander suggested I should start thinking about retirement. But after hearing about Captain Mitchell's case and seeing how she stood up for herself, I decided to fight back. I requested my own fitness evaluation, passed it with flying colors, and I'm still flying. Your example gave me the courage to stand up. Thank you." Sarah read the email twice, then looked up at Hargrove with tears in her eyes. "There are a dozen more like that," Hargrove said gently. "Pilots across the Air Force who heard your story and found their own courage. You didn't lose, Sarah. You won. Maybe not the way you expected, but you won." Sarah handed back the phone and wiped her eyes. "I just wanted to fly, sir. That's all I ever wanted." "And you're flying. Tomorrow you're leading a training mission. Next month you're deploying to the Middle East for a 6-month rotation. The year after that, who knows? But you're here, you're flying, and you made a difference. That's not nothing." He was right. Sarah knew he was right, but the fight had taken its toll. She felt older, more tired, less certain of her place in the world. The next morning, Sarah suited up for her first official flight in over 2 months. As she walked across the tarmac toward her A-10, she saw a group of younger pilots gathered near their planes, watching her. And instead of the dismissive looks she had gotten used to, she saw something different in their eyes. Respect. Captain Brennan was not among them. He had been quietly transferred to another base, his career permanently stained by the IG's finding that his complaint was without merit and potentially motivated by personal animus. Sarah took no pleasure in his downfall, but she didn't mourn it either. She climbed into her cockpit and went through the pre-flight checklist with practiced efficiency. The familiar instruments, the comfortable seat, the smell of jet fuel and hydraulic fluid, it all felt like coming home. Viper 1, you are cleared for takeoff, the tower radioed. Roger Tower, Viper 1 rolling. Sarah pushed the throttles forward, and the A-10 roared down the runway. At exactly the right moment, she pulled back on the stick, and the plane lifted into the air with that perfect feeling that never got old, no matter how many times she experienced it. She climbed into the clear blue sky, banked left over the desert, and smiled behind her oxygen mask. This was where she belonged, this was who she was. Below her, the Nevada desert stretched out in shades of brown and red and gold. Ahead of her, the sky went on forever, and for the first time in months, Sarah felt free. The training mission went perfectly. Sarah led her flight through a series of complicated maneuvers, demonstrating the skills and judgment that had earned her 12 years in the cockpit. When they returned to base 2 hours later, she felt more alive than she had in a long time. As she shut down the engines and climbed out of the cockpit, Colonel Hargrove was waiting for her on the tarmac. "Welcome back, Captain," he said with a grin. "It's good to be back, sir. I have news. The Air Force Times wants to do a story about your case. They want to interview you about age discrimination and women in combat roles." Sarah hesitated. Part of her wanted to say no, to put the whole ordeal behind her and just fly. But then she thought about that email from the F-16 pilot in Germany and the other pilots who had been inspired by her fight. "I'll do it," she said, "but only if I can speak freely about what happened. I wouldn't have it any other way." The article came out 3 weeks later. It was front-page news in the Air Force Times with a photo of Sarah in her flight gear standing in front of her A-10. The headline read, "Captain Mitchell's Fight, One Pilot's Battle Against Age Discrimination." The article told the whole story: the engine failure, the survival, the investigation, and the unfair treatment she had endured from Captain Brennan and others. But it also told the story of her resilience, her determination to keep flying despite every obstacle. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Sarah received emails and letters from pilots across all branches of the military, thanking her for speaking out. A congressman read the article and called for a hearing on age discrimination in the armed forces. Military advocacy groups took up her cause, pushing for policy changes. And slowly, things began to change. The mandatory annual evaluations for pilots over 40 were revised to be less burdensome and more focused on actual performance metrics. Sensitivity training about age discrimination became part of officer education. And most importantly, commanders were put on notice that discriminatory treatment would not be tolerated. It wasn't a complete victory. The military culture didn't change overnight, but it was a start. 6 months later, Sarah deployed to the Middle East as planned. She flew combat missions in support of coalition forces, providing close air support for troops on the ground. She flew with the same skill and courage she had always shown, earning the respect of everyone she worked with. One day, during a particularly intense mission, Sarah's flight was called in to support a unit that was pinned down by enemy fire. The situation was desperate. The troops were taking casualties and running low on ammunition. Sarah and her wingman rolled in hot, engaging enemy positions with devastating precision. When it was over, the ground commander radioed his thanks. "Viper 1, you just saved our lives. Best close air support I've ever seen." "Just doing my job," Sarah replied. But the satisfaction she felt was deeper than any medal or commendation could provide. This was why she flew, not for the glory or the recognition, but for the people on the ground who counted on her. That night, back at the base, Sarah sat in her quarters and wrote a letter to the F-16 pilot in Germany who had thanked her months earlier. "Keep fighting," she wrote. "Keep flying. Don't let anyone tell you that you can't do this job because of your age or your gender or any other reason that has nothing to do with your ability. You earned your wings. Make them pry them from your cold, dead hands." She sealed the letter and smiled. Then she turned off the light and went to sleep, ready for whatever mission came tomorrow. Years later, when people asked Sarah about her career, she didn't talk about the medals or the combat missions or the thousands of hours she had logged in the cockpit. She talked about the fight to keep flying, about standing up to discrimination, about proving that experience mattered more than youth. "I was declared lost," she would say, "but I found my way back, and in doing so, I found my voice." On a crisp autumn morning, 10 years after the engine failure that had started it all, Sarah took her last flight as an Air Force pilot. She was 51 years old, and this time, retirement was her choice. She had flown for 22 years, longer than most pilots ever dreamed of, and she had done it on her own terms. As she taxied her A-10 to the parking spot for the final time, she saw the crowd gathered to see her off. Young pilots, old friends, commanders she had served with, and standing at the front was Colonel Hargrove, now a general with tears in his eyes. Sarah shut down the engines and climbed out of the cockpit one last time. She stood on the wing and looked at the plane that had carried her through so many missions, so many challenges. "Thank you," she whispered, patting the fuselage. "Thank you for bringing me home." She climbed down and walked toward the crowd. They applauded as she approached, and Sarah felt her eyes fill with tears. But they were good tears. Tears of pride and satisfaction and the knowledge that she had lived a life that mattered. General Hargrove stepped forward and saluted her. "Captain Mitchell, on behalf of the United States Air Force, thank you for your service." Sarah returned the salute, her hand steady and sure. "It was my honor, sir." The ceremony ended with a flyover, 4 A-10s in formation, thundering overhead in tribute. Sarah watched them climb into the sky, and she felt at peace. She had fought the good fight, she had kept the faith, she had finished the race. And she had done it her way. As the crowd dispersed and people came up to shake her hand and offer congratulations, Sarah looked up at the clear blue sky one more time. Somewhere up there, another pilot was flying, facing their own challenges, fighting their own battles. And because of what Sarah had done, because of the stand she had taken, maybe that pilot would have an easier road. Maybe they would remember that age is just a number, that experience is valuable, and that anyone who has the skill and the determination deserves a chance to fly. Sarah Mitchell walked off the flight line for the last time with her head held high, knowing that her legacy would live on in every pilot who refused to give up, in every person who stood up to discrimination, in every voice that said no, when the world tried to force them into silence. Command had declared her lost, but she had found herself, and in the end that was all that mattered. The sound of the A-10s faded into the distance, leaving only the whisper of the wind and the warmth of the sun. And Sarah smiled because she knew that somewhere out there, another pilot was climbing into the cockpit, ready to write their own story. The legacy would continue, the fight would go on, and the thunder of courage would echo through the clouds forever.